So I'm going to talk to you about where our traits come from, and our traits are things that describe us. Could be hair color, could be eye color. Now our traits come from the genes that we have in our body. Okay, if I look at a chromosome, we have 23 pairs of these in each cell. This is our genetic information. If I zoom way in on a chromosome, I'll see that it's made out of little genes, and these are instructions that my body can read. So here's instructions for how my body should build something about me. And if I look at each chromosome, this is a pair of chromosomes. If I look at the other half of the chromosome, I'll see that there is another gene in the same place. Those are for the same trait, but they're slightly different. Okay, so these are both genes, but they're different kinds. We would call these alleles. My genotype is made up of 2 alleles for each trait. Now, depending what these alleles are telling my body, my genotype is going to affect what kind of trait I have. And these alleles can be either dominant or recessive, and we're going to talk about that more in a second. But one genotype, so describing my alleles, is called heterozygous. You'll see I've written it with different letters because heterozygous means one dominant allele, which is usually a capital letter, and one recessive allele, which is usually a lowercase letter. That's why you've seen that I've written dominant in all capitals, recessive in all lowercase, because when we look at a Punnett square or something, a dominant allele is written in capital letters and a recessive one is written in lowercase letters. If I have a dominant and a recessive, I call that heterozygous. Now the other type of genotype I may have is a homozygous genotype. That means both of the alleles I have are the same. So I could have 2 dominant alleles or 2 recessive alleles. Those would both be homozygous genotypes, and I would call that either a homozygous dominant or a homozygous recessive genotype. I could have also written homozygous like this. So I could have a homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive. That just means 2 of the same alleles. Okay, so what does this have to do with our traits? Well, our phenotype, I drew this inside of a Polaroid picture because a phenotype is our physical characteristic, or what I would see if I took a picture of a trait. All right, so I can have a dominant phenotype, which happens anytime I have a dominant allele involved. So here I have a dominant and recessive allele. Since I have a dominant allele, my body is only going to listen to that dominant allele, and that would lead to a dominant phenotype. So if I have a heterozygous genotype, because there is one dominant allele, I would get a dominant phenotype. Now the other type of phenotype I could have is a recessive one. The only time I can get a recessive phenotype is if I have 2 recessive alleles, because as long as there's a dominant allele, my body will not listen to a recessive allele. So to have a recessive phenotype, I have to have a homozygous recessive genotype. So homozygous dominant and heterozygous would both lead to a dominant phenotype, and only a homozygous recessive genotype would lead to a recessive phenotype. We're going to look at how all these words fit into a Punnett square. So we're going to say this Punnett square is looking at the trait for hair type, and dominant is for straight hair, and recessive is for curly hair. Alright, so we're going to put mom and dad's genotype on the top and side, and we're going to say that they are both heterozygous for this trait. Now if I fill out my Punnett square, we're going to look at what genotypes each box would get. So I have 2 heterozygous, that means different alleles. I have 1 homozygous recessive, which means 2 recessive alleles. And I have 1 homozygous dominant, which means 2 dominant alleles. Now, anytime I have a dominant allele, I will get the dominant phenotype, even if, in this case, I have a dominant and a recessive. Because there is 1 dominant allele, I'll get that dominant trait of straight hair. So, I have 3 of these would lead me to a straight hair or a dominant phenotype. This one, because it's got 2 recessives, is the only way I can get a recessive phenotype.